How you going, people? Let's talk about grand jury. I got a question about whether or not what I thought about professional jurors. Now, I'm not sure of the question. It was kind of vague. You know, I don't know if there's some jurisdiction out there that's having professional juries, but in my mind, a professional jury is a grand jury. A jury that kind of sits all the time. It's not picked randomly. So, the grand jury is probably the most, what I consider a professional jury out there. I got pros and cons with a grand jury. So, let's kind of discuss what a grand jury is. A grand jury, they call it grand because it has more jurors than a regular jury. A regular jury that you go to trial has 12 members unless you, as the defendant, decide to have less. If I'm being charged by the government and I say, you know what, I only want 6 jurors. I'll only have a 6-jury panel. If I say I only want 3 jurors, I can have a 3-jury panel. I can have a 1-jury panel. Obviously, the more people, because the jury has to be unanimous, the more people you have, the more beneficial it is to you, because then you only have to convince one person you're not guilty. So, why someone would choose less than 12 jurors, I don't know. But, I mean, it's been done. Some people will agree to 6 or 9 jury panel. So, in a grand jury, because it has more than 12, normally 23, 24, some places only have 12. But I mean, the grand jury was designed to be larger than a regular jury. So it's a grand jury. Actually, the grand jury refers to a regular jury as a petite, a smaller jury. So they call it a petite jury is a 12-member jury. The grand jury normally has more members. Doesn't have to, but I mean, over history, how the grand jury came out and everything, I mean, it's been around for years. A lot of countries still use it. They use the kind of the same premise, but it's a little bit different. Actually, I think one of the first grand juries was back when the Catholics were running the system and pretty much was the government, and I still think religion is a form of government, but when the Catholics did it, and they had the grand jury, they would I forgot what they called it. They didn't call it the grand jury, the assignment or assize or something. They had a group of citizens, and they would literally throw the defendant in the freaking water. And if you sank and drowned, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. I mean, it goes back to burning the witches. If they burnt you at the stake as a witch, if you were a real witch, you could stop it. But if you burnt and died, then they were wrong and they were sorry and you must have not been a witch. I mean, human history just goes on. But anyway, so I digress. So, the grand jury's been around, and the grand jury now, some states use it, some states do not. The federal government still uses it. It was designed as a protection from huge government takeover and protecting the people from an oppressive, tyrannical government. That's kind of why it's there. It's people chosen from the community that gets to check on government. So when a prosecutor comes to a grand jury and says, I want to prosecute this person, the grand jury, the people from the community, should be able to say, man, we think you're going after him for political reasons, or we don't think you have a strong enough case, or we don't think there's enough evidence you should be going after him. They have the power of the people, have the power to hold government in check and accountable. Now, I've always said that the DA is the most powerful person in these countries, and people aren't more focused on how crooked and easy it is to be crooked when you're a DA. So, the DA pretty much runs the grand jury. The thing about a grand jury is they do not determine innocent or guilt. A lot of people think, oh, if the grand jury indicts you, you're guilty. That's not true. That can be further. The grand jury does not determine innocent and guilt. There's no attachment. You can't be double jeopardy in a grand jury. I can take you to grand jury 20 times if I want to. Now, some states require, if you come back to the grand jury, you have to bring new evidence. You can't just keep coming back with the same evidence and trying. But, shit, as long as statute of limitations doesn't run out, I can come after you as many times as I want the grand jury. If I'm a prosecutor and I want you, and I take you to grand jury, and the grand jury comes back with what's called a no bill. A no bill means we don't think there's enough to prosecute. And also it used to be called, I think, ignoramus. They used to write on a bill instead of writing a true bill. A true bill would be, we think he's guilty. A no bill is he's not, or he's not, there's not enough to charge. Not guilty, I'm sorry, I said the wrong word. They do not determine innocent and guilt. They determine whether there's enough evidence to charge the person with the crime that they're accused of. So a no bill means we don't think there's enough evidence to charge him. A true bill means we think there's enough to charge him. Now, again, the prosecutor with the most power in this country can still prosecute you if you get a no bill. And I know people are going to be like, oh, they won't do that. I'm telling you, they can still prosecute you if you get a no bill. All they have to do is go to judge, say, look, I think there's probable cause. Grand jury got it wrong. I'm still going to prosecute. It's totally up to the DA's discretion on who he prosecutes and who he doesn't. I think if the grand jury does indict, the DA can still say, I ain't prosecuting him. But that's not going to happen. People are like, oh, that'll never happen. Yeah, it won't happen because the prosecutor gets to pick what cases he takes to the grand jury, and the prosecutor gets to make his case to the grand jury. So if I want to indict somebody, I can go in there and make my case, and the grand jury will go, true bill, indict him. But you know what? I can also go in there, give the grand jury half-ass evidence, do a half-ass job, bring in some inconsistent witnesses, knowing that I don't want to prosecute, but I'm a Weasley DA attorney, and instead of saying I don't want to prosecute, I'm going to make the grand jury come to the conclusion that there's not enough there. That way it's not me, it's the grand jury. It's your representatives. That's the flaws with the grand jury. And like in all things in life, yin and yang, there's good and bad. So the grand jury can be good or bad. When the grand jury becomes a pawn of the prosecutor, which I think it 90% of the time it is, because you develop this working relationship. You hear the lawyer talking. In a grand jury, the only lawyer in the room is the stinking prosecutor. There's no other side. There's no judge. There's no rules of evidence. If I'm a prosecutor and I want to get you in a grand jury, I can bring in hearsay evidence. Hearsay evidence is pretty much what I call gossip. You can't really prove it. It's just what you heard, what somebody else told you. That's kind of hearsay evidence to me. So as a prosecutor, I can bring that in a grand jury knowing I will not be able to use that to prosecute him. But I can let the grand jury hear it and they'll be like, oh man, I believe all that? Wow, I think you ought to prosecute him. Now I can say, you know what, the grand jury said I was prosecute. So now when I take it to a jury and I lose, I can say, you know what, the grand jury said I should prosecute. I knew it wasn't that good of a case. So the DA always has his weasel wiggle room to blame someone else because he can't stand up and say, you know what, I'm an elected DA. I'm doing the right thing for the community. I'm doing the right thing, what I was elected to do. And if you don't want to reelect me, then don't reelect me. But I'm going to do my job the way I should do it. I'm not going to do my job to keep my job. And that's the problem with our politics and our government. We got too many government officials trying to keep their job instead of doing their job. So that's my problem with the grand jury. Is it a good thing? Yes. If you get people from the community and they go, you know what? We're not going to let this DA run roughshod on anybody. We're not going to let him run around and do unlawful prosecutions and indict people just because he's mad, just because of their political affiliation, just because of something, it was a friend of his that the crime was committed to, so he's going to go after this guy. That shouldn't happen. The grand jury should be a check on government to protect people from government coming after them for the wrong reason. Does that happen? No. People in a grand jury are usually law-abiding citizens who trust the system, who trust the government, who the government picks to be on the grand jury. It's not like the community members pick the grand jury. The government picks, either judges, prosecutors. In California, the DA pretty much picks who's on the grand jury. So, they become pawns of the prosecutor, and they get played by the prosecutor because they don't know any better. And they trust the prosecutor because they don't know any better. And so they believe the prosecutor when a prosecutor says, this is the law, and this is what you should do. And they're like, you know what, he's prosecutor, he knows, okay, we'll let him take it to trial. Because in the grand jury's mind, we're not really putting a guy guilty or innocent, we're just saying whether he's going to trial or not. Now, I think that's a big decision, because I don't think somebody should be charged and put through that process when they're not guilty, because then the prosecutor has leverage to make that person take a plea deal. to give him a lower charge so he doesn't possibly face more exposure of more prison time. So there's this, our political system always has these turns in the road and blind corners that people get caught in. And if you've never been in a system, you've never been charged, and most people won't, and if they are, they're usually in it one time, and they just learn to avoid it, or they learn they don't want to do it again, or they learn it's too damn crooked, and they just try to avoid it. So, I mean, is the grand jury a good thing? Its design and intent was a good thing. It gave people power to hold government in check. That's always a good thing. Never a good thing to give government power where the people can't put them in check. That's why when you take the guns, you take away the power of the people to hold the government in check. Because the government, remember, it only takes 3% of the people, of an armed people, to overthrow a tyrannical government. It takes something like 56 of unarmed people to overthrow a tyrannical government. That's why when unarmed people, you never see them overthrow a government. Unless everybody's dying and it's like, you know, Venezuela, nobody's eating, you can't make a living, everybody's getting robbed, I mean, crime's out of control, the government's shooting people in the streets. But Rick, socialism and liberalism is great. Everything should be free and we should have more government that provides everything. Alright, so I wanted to stick on grand jury because you know how I am about getting on my gun. So I made a couple notes to make sure I covered everything. Let me make sure I covered everything. Grand juries, basically they call it a supermajority. When I said in order to get a no bill or a true bill, to get a true bill, you just need a supermajority. Some people will say if you have 12 people, you need 9 to say, yes, charge them. So the standard in convincing everybody is less in a grand jury to get an indictment. Although a lot of people who don't know the system, ooh, the grand jury indicted him, he must be guilty. No, BS. They heard one side, they heard the prosecution with no defense. Now, a big problem I have with a grand jury is a suspect ought to have the right to petition a grand jury and say, I want to speak on my behalf and I want to be at the grand jury and I want you to hear my side. Now, the grand jury has a lot of power, and that's why government controlling it is not good, because the grand jury can hear whatever they want or they can not hear it. They can say, you know what, defendant, we're going to go ahead and let you testify. Or they can say, you know what, we don't care what you say, we ain't going to hear you. Grand jury has a lot. They can subpoena, they can hold you in contempt if you lie. It's secret. Now they say it's secret to protect witnesses and to protect defendants who are accused of a crime and then they're held, you know, they get a no bill. So they want to protect them. That's not why it's secret. It's secret so the government can do what the hell it wants and nobody can challenge it or come out except the members of the grand jury, who are pretty much pawns or working for the government because they're picked by the government. They think the government's right. They're on the side of law and order. They think all DAs, because they're lawyers, have honor and integrity, so therefore they follow them and people get screwed every day. So, let me go back to my list because, okay, so, grand jury, supermajority, it doesn't have to be unanimous, no bill, true bill, or they call it ignoramus for no bill. A petite jury, prosecutor uses a grand jury for his own uses. The way the prosecutor uses it is to get out of political heat. If the community's in an outroar and the DA doesn't want to prosecute, he will take it to a grand jury and either make his case good or bad and get the grand jury to do what he wants to do, but he doesn't have to say it. He can blame the grand jury for it. So that's how the prosecutor uses a grand jury against the people, which is against the way the grand jury was designed to protect the people from government. So, I just can't, people aren't taught this in schools anymore, to distrust the government, to know that the government power. I mean, when I was a kid and I went to school, they were still teaching American history and how, look, government power is always bad. You have to keep them in control. You have to challenge and question government or they get out of control, they'll stomp on rights, they'll take away rights, and they infringe on freedoms of the people. That's not taught anymore. Freaking liberals are out there saying, oh, government's great, we need more so they can give us free stuff, and then nobody has to work, and we get free college and free everything, and then the government will just protect us, because you're a damn idiot. Alright, I digress. Let's see. Float bodies, I talked about that. Hearsay. Now hearsay, here's a little quick little crazy cop story that I had. And I'll throw in here on how jurors and how prosecutors can do it. That dirty DA, Jeff Reisig, when they were prosecuting this case against this, I think they call it the Halloween homicide was the case. But these guys went out and shot some people and everything. They're prosecuting a case, and this is when I end up turning them in for trying to hide evidence. This was a death penalty case. It's a serious case. Well, he had his little sleazy lieutenant. I called him Smell-a-Bob because he was freaking a weasel, and he had a little man syndrome, but he was so wanting to be in charge. You know, he would kiss the upper echelon's ass and would do anything. I always said, I guarantee you he would help them hide a body in a trunk if they asked him to, because he couldn't say no. He was just a good company man. He was a good team player. They loved him because he would do anything. Well, he'd also lie for him. So he gets on the stand and he testifies in order to corroborate this witness, this felony, that they cut a deal and said, hey man, we'll give you 10 years off your sentence if you testify the way we want to. Okay, so they get him in there to testify. So Reisig puts this Smell-a-Bob lieutenant on the stand and says, is it possible to see this gunfire from the distance that the felon, who people may not believe, would you corroborate and help his testimony? Is it true that you could see that? And he said, yes. Our firearms experts and our firearm instructors, Rick Gore and Randy Skaggs, did a test, and they found that you can see it. That's called hearsay, because he's saying what we said. In court, you need to bring in the people that say it so that person can be deposed by the other side. Well, and Reisig knows that piece of shit, dirty, whatever. I won't get off on him. So he knew that, but he's playing a system, he's playing stupid. So he gets hearsay in by putting his sleazy Smell-a-Bob lieutenant up there to lie to the grand jury. But who's going to prosecute him for lying, Rick? Well, the DA isn't, because he put him up there. He's working for him. So he gets up there and says, we're going to say something that we're not going to say. It's an absolute lie. We didn't say it. We never said it. We weren't going to say it. Well, the defense, who's on the ball, said, Your Honor, objection, hearsay. Rick Gore and Randy Skaggs ought to be on the stand if they said that. And here's where sleazy Jeff Reisig, how to manipulate the system and be the crookedest DA in the country. Here's how he got around that. Your Honor, I'm planning on calling them later. Lieutenant Smell-a-Bob is just testifying on what they said for expediency. I will call them later to confirm this. So it was done. We call that ringing a bell. You can't unring the bell. The jury heard a lieutenant, a star witness from the prosecution, confirm what the felon said. The prosecution objected. It looked like sleazy lawyer tricks, and the DA came out and goes, oh, I'm planning on calling them. Guess what? Me and Randy Skaggs were never called. I wanted to testify because I said that ain't true, that's bullshit. I was never called. The case was done, settled, guilty was found, and me or Randy never testified. The defense messed up. They should have caught that and went, hey, he said he was going to call them. You let this evidence in, and now my client's guilty. You know what? The defense didn't care. And again, I think in that case, the guy was probably guilty anyway. But the rules weren't followed. Sleazy tricks were played. Jeff Reisig's a lying piece of shit. He did his sleazy tricks. Smell-a-Bob did his shit. So, I mean, that's just how a prosecutor can manipulate a jury and the system, lie, get away with it, and then make it seem like, oh, those are standard courtroom procedures. They object, and we have to stand. So anyway, there's a little crazy cop story for you thrown in there. Grand juries are one-sided, no defense. They're secret to protect the witness and suspect. They're supposed to shield the people from the government, which it doesn't. They basically become a rubber stamp for the government. Oh, Clinton and Nixon are the only two presidents that got involved in the grand jury. Nixon, I think, had to testify for a grand jury after he was impeached, or quit, resigned before he was impeached. So he had to testify in front of a grand jury. Clinton is the only president sitting that had to testify for a grand jury, and that's because of his crooked ass, should-be-in-prison wife, Hillary, and him with their, what was that law firm that they were in? Shit, I can't think of it. But they were testifying about hiding evidence and who they... So he was the only sitting president that had to go in front of a grand jury. And he might have went in front of a grand jury for the blue dress, sperm stains, his DNA on her dress, that he said, I did not have sex with that woman. And everybody loves him because he's a freaking dumbass liberal, and their standard is you gotta lie, cheat, and be a piece of shit in order to be ahead of the liberal party. All right, I digress. They don't determine guilt or innocent. BP Alan Burr. This is pretty good. Alan Burr was the vice president, and they indicted him for as being a traitor. Well, he petitioned that, hey, the grand jury is made up of all Republicans, and I'm not Republican, and they're going to find me guilty because they're political. And the judge dismissed and made them check and get other jurors because they determined that, hey, you know what? If you have a grand jury of nothing but Republicans, then they're probably going to rule against Democrats. And if you have a grand jury of nothing but Democrats, they're probably going to rule against them. And when we have this liberal society with liberals running DAs and politicians and mayors, and they're picking liberal juries, you wonder why conservatives who believes in freedom and gun rights are getting screwed left and right. I digress. All right, so Allen was indicted. He wasn't convicted. They did, even though they switched some of the grand juries, they did indict him, but he wasn't convicted. And then who was the other one? I think OJ was another problem. In this court, they pretty much dismissed the whole grand jury. The jury says, you know what? The judge said, this grand jury has seen too much evidence, and they heard the tapes of where his wife was saying, OJ's breaking into my door before she died, but he didn't do it and the glove didn't fit. So because they heard that 911 tape and that was going to be excluded, I guess somehow they got that suppressed during the trial, there was some issue with it, they excluded the entire grand jury because they go, you know what, they're biased because they probably heard that tape and they can't decide on whether or not to indict poor black man innocent OJ of a crime. They can't do it without bias. So he dismissed the whole damn grand jury. But anyway, that wasn't on my list. Let's see, convicted, okay, so I think I covered everything I wanted. That's the grand jury in a nutshell. Again, nothing's easy in the law and the legal. That's why when people get out here and go, well, the law says, and this, and the con. Look, man, it's all, it's all clay to be formed by the people who either make it good for the people or who make it good for the government. And that's never a good thing. So hopefully you have a better understanding of the grand jury. I don't know if anybody knows what kind of flag that is. Anyway, we'll end that there on the grand jury.